in these conversations of online teaching, my hope is that we start with something that maybe has a technical or procedural element, like today's topic, online teaching, but before it's been assessments or something like using the studio in electrical engineering. My hope is that we start with this technical topic, but then we break out into a more general topic of teaching and teaching online. So today's topic, peer-based grading, it seems to me is perfect for that, because Bobby has done some tremendous peer-based grading, and I think he can show us how he's done that. But then we can talk about how we utilize the concept of peers grading themselves in an educational venue more broadly. It can be about online, but it can be about distance, but it can be about residential learning as well. So that's my hope for all these discussions. And I put in the chat the link to the website where we've been cataloging these talks. And we started with HP Schnabel, who did the most wonderful and gripping, I think, engaging talk on how he's generated Coursera courses from his distance classes. So we've had some good talks, and I invite you to the website. Let me start today by just saying it gives me the greatest of pleasure to welcome Bobby Schnabel to our discussion group. I was looking at Bobby's CV and his bio, and what an amazing, amazing career at Boulder, but in the nation and in the world. Bobby, of course, is professor of CS and external chair of computer sciences. Before that, he was CEO at a company called Association for Computing Machinery, did that for 2 years. Before that, he was dean of the School of Informatics and Computing at Indiana University. Tremendous, but wonderfully, before that, he was here too. And he chaired CS, he was associate dean for academic affairs, and he was vice provost for academic and campus computing and chief information officer. I actually didn't know that detail. I did know that in his tenure at Boulder before coming back, he founded the Atlas Institute. He was co-founder of NC WIT. And now in his return, he's been instrumental, I would say a founder of the MSDS on Coursera. And it is that I'm asking him to talk about today. The MSDS is, of course, the data science degree on Coursera. It has been an amazing success, both within the university, an interdisciplinary nexus for teaching, but also on Coursera, a tremendous success. Bobby, I don't know how many students are in it right now. I think over 1,000, and it's not even its first year. So absolutely amazing. Bobby, really, your imprimatur on success after success is humbling. Amazing work. So I invited Bobby to talk about peer-based grading, and that was, I wanted him to talk about anything regarding the DS. He chose peer-based grading, and he suggested this is going to be more of a discussion. But I would say that Bobby not only was instrumental in administering the MSDS, but he also was teaching a course called Ethical Issues in Data Science, and that's where he's used peer-based grading. So I am now going to stifle it and turn it over to our wonderful guest today, Bobby Schnabel. Bobby, thank you for joining us.
Okay, so thank you, William. And given what you just said, I think your talk may be longer than mine. Because I said to William at the start that sure, I'd be happy to do this, but really it would just be an opportunity to get advice about something that I feel I could really use advice about. And William said, and I said I could probably do that part of it in a couple of minutes. And William said, well, why don't you take a little bit of time to tell them something about yourself? So I've got a little outline here as that as well, but you just did all of that. So given that, there really may be fairly little to say. I'm looking out at the Hollywood squares and feeling even more sheepish, because this is an amazing assemblage of people, and I'm feeling a little bit guilty about the time I may be able to take about some from people and hope that it's worthwhile, and that'll totally be the conversation. If I was going to give this talk in the shortest talk ever, it would be, we've used peer grading in one course. It doesn't work all that well, and it would be great to get some advice and get some advice, end of talk. And so I'll say a little bit more, but probably most important, I want to introduce Allison Weinberger. As those of you who know Coursera know, as you have courses there, the 4-credit courses, you have course facilitators, and they're the ones who interact with the students, and the developers only do once removed through the course facilitator. And I've been privileged to have an outstanding course facilitator since we launched this in Allison, who's also had a big association with CU. So Allison, if you could just tell people for now a little bit about your background and what you're doing currently, that'd be great.
Yeah, hi, I'm Allison. I'm super lucky because I get to be Dr. Schnabel's facilitator for ethical issues in data science. I'm also facilitating Dr. Dougherty's probability theory course, and then next session I'll be facilitating the effective communications capstone. I did my undergrad at CU in math and philosophy, and now I'm a PhD student in philosophy, so it's fun. Thanks, Dr. Schnabel.
Yeah, and Allison, I have been told by people who had her as an undergraduate, was an absolute star student here. Started her PhD here and is now actually going to be going to Michigan to continue her PhD in philosophy. So great person to work with. I was going to explain a little bit about how I got here, because this is part, as William said, of the Master's in Data Science and a course on ethical issues, neither of which have anything to do with what my original background was. When I started here in 1977, it was working in numerical computation. And then, as William said, I quickly got into, or by academic standards, 13 years later, got into to various administrative stuff, probably the most fun of which ever was the Atlas Institute. And it is a misstatement to say that that I got that going, because there were two of us who got that going, Diane and me, and Diane is on the call. So there's Diane Sieber. I was a director, and I roped Diane in early in her faculty career, but an awful lot of it is due to Diane. Then when I went to Indiana University as dean of the computing school there, one of the things that we did there was start master's degree in data science. I think it's roughly 7 years before we did it here. And I was actually less in the trenches about that than here, but still had quite a bit of involvement about that. And that was also both residential and online. Although the online one was through the IU system, kind of analogous to Canvas here, as opposed to through a vendor. And then William described ACM as a corporation. It is, but it's ACM is the main professional computing society nationally and internationally. And that was the first place that I got involved in ethics issues, including working with the National AI Society to co-found a conference on ethical issues in AI, which continues to run annually. I'm still on the steering committee for that. And so that's a little bit of background. And when I came back here in 2018, we'd never left Boulder entirely. We'd always had our house, and my wife had mainly been here. And William, I looked this up. It took a year at that point, or nearly, until I got pointed to you by a bunch of people. Robert, you may have been one of them. Robert McDonald and I knew each other from IU, actually. William at that point was the vice provost for academic innovation, and he had a cabal of people, including two of his graduated PhD students, Quentin McAndrew and Randall Fullington, who are amazing people. And they were already working on this master's in data science idea. It was early days, and drafted me to be involved in that. And I ended up co-leading the academic side of that. And at about the same time, I had already also launched a course in the computer science department on Computing Ethics and Society. And so I guess it was those two things that came together and made it natural to suggest that we have a course on ethical issues in data science. And so there's a 3-credit core consisting of 3 1-credit courses the students take their first semester residentially. And that's one of those courses. And so I've taught that course for the first time last fall residentially. But before that, we created the online version of it, which launched as a non-credit course about a year ago, as a 4-credit course, I think last June, and that's where Allison has been involved from the outset. And so that brings us back to where did peer grading come in? So if you look at that course of Computing Ethics and Society, while it's in the computer science department, it's basically a humanities social science style course. The students read things. A lot of what they read is from the current media. Diane has taught a course that has a fair bit in common with this actually in Atlas. The students then often lead the discussions of what they've read. You know, one person will present something. Then you have a bunch of group discussions. And then the students also write things. And so when you think about kind of how do you port that style over to an online environment, the reading part goes fine. The discussing part, part of it, I do more talking on the Coursera course than I do in the residential course, or do more presenting, because you don't have the option of having the students present the readings to the class. The students still do plenty of discussions. Discussion groups do well, but then you get to the grading. And so when I started out with that, I see Leah here, and Leah's colleague Scott was working with me. We talked about that, and they said, oh, we have peer-based grading. And so the way that you would approach that sort of thing would be to use peer-based grading. And that's what we have done. And now I want to just reflect a tiny bit. If you think about your experiences, either yourselves grading essay type work or as a student having the essay type work graded. In a small class where the students write and the faculty member grades, William, you can tell me, or Diane or anybody else, do you actually write out a rubric for yourself on how you grade? Or is it more the old fashioned thing that you read it and say, yeah, well, William's nodding, that's a B+. And I think a lot of us tend to do that. And, you know, we think we get that right, and you could ask all sorts of issues. But of course, as soon as you scale up, that doesn't port. So if you have a larger class, like the second time I taught the Computing Ethics and Society, and you have TAs doing the grading, you already have to have some sort of a rubric that you discuss with the TAs, and you may look over their shoulder. And my limited experience with that is that the TAs tend to generally be more generous than you would be. You know, the people, I think, the less empowered you feel, the less, and I see Diane nodding, it's just human nature. It may be age, it may be the responsibility, I'm not sure what that is. And so what we've then done is tried to port all of that to Coursera. And so now I'm just going to share the screen once. Let's see, no, that's the wrong one. There we go. So this is a sample assignment. There's only 2 sorts of writing assignments we have in this course. There's one that there's a couple instances of where they pick out an article, usually from current media, and write a report. There's another one where they interview a professional in the field, but the points are the same, so I'll stick to this. So the article assignment is simple. These are short essays, and basically we're asking them to do 3 things. Write a summary of the article, point out at least one issue in data ethics that the article is relevant to, and then do an assessment of the ethical considerations. And we do talk about philosophical frameworks, and so, or ethical frameworks, so we ask them to link to that. So the first time we did this, the rubric, and this was my fault at this point, was, or my responsibility, was this very simple thing. This is what the students saw. And it basically broke it into 3 parts. How good was the summary? How good was the assessment? And did they do an ethical framework? And for the first 2, they kind of had an excellent, good, fair, poor scale. And the last one is a little closer to a yes, no. And the observation was that almost all the grades were A. And that comes through Allison, and I'm going to turn this back over to Allison in a moment. And so recently we thought, well, maybe if we give them a little more detailed rubric, that'll make it easier for them to be a little bit more critical, may not be the word, but just differentiate a little bit more in the grading. And so this is the current rubric. It's a little bit too much to read here, but there's 2 key points. One is that we actually made it simpler. Even though it looks like a lot of words, there used to be an excellent, good, fair, poor scale. We took out the 3rd one. So it's now just essentially an excellent, good, poor scale. So from that point of view, we made it simpler for them, realizing that they weren't going to do the harsh grading anyhow. And then we tried to have a little bit more description of what they see. And I could show you the Coursera site, but I think the key thing is that when you're submitting this essay on Coursera, you're seeing the rubric right there. So you know how you're going to be graded. And that's probably the most important reason for having the little bit more explanation of what each thing really means, so that you can write, you can consider that when you write your essay. So that's where we are now. And as far as I know, it hasn't worked a whole lot better. But Allison, at this point, I wanted to turn it over to you to either to comment on that. You're probably a little more up to date than I am, actually, about how well it's working this session. And at that point, we're done, and we're going to turn it open to discussion. And I'm greatly hoping that there's some other people here who have experience with this in one way or another, and that we all can learn. So, Allison?
Yeah, thanks, Dr. Schnabel. Well, I should say that this is the first session we've applied this new rubric to, so not a huge sample size, but it seems that so far the quality of the students' writing is improved, like they're doing more analysis and kind of have clearer guidelines from the rubric on what their analysis should be. As far as grading each other, it does seem still that students are giving each other maybe higher grades than seems fair or fit, so that would be an area for improvement.
But
Yeah.
that's actually encouraging from a teacher's point of view, because ultimately it's less of a concern about whether we're grading as harshly as we could, if I want to use that, than if the students are learning. And so I think you're saying that it actually has in some sense improved the student experience as far as what they write, and hopefully therefore what they learn. So that's a very interesting perspective. William, I don't know if you've seen this sort of thing, but when I look at the Coursera grades in general, they tend to be pretty high. I mean, there's quite a number of students who don't make it through the courses, but the students who make it through the courses overwhelmingly get A's as opposed to B's, which are the only 2 grades that pass you in a graduate course. So in some sense, that may be less the concern in the end than the learning. Okay, so I'm afraid that that's, as I said, the wisdom I have on this is exceedingly limited, and I'm hoping that the other people at this point can join in. Maybe we should do one little poll first and get a sense of how many other people on this call have experience with peer-based grading, either online or in some other context which you think is analogous.
So, Jean, go ahead.
Yeah. Hi, Jean.
Hi. So I've done quite a bit actually of peer-based grading. Generally for, as you did, for more qualitative assignments, not for the, the ones where, yes, this is right and that's wrong. You're right, the students are unwilling in general to really be harsh with each other. But if we give them tools, I've found that they can be substantive with each other. And to me, I think that's way more important than getting any kind of grade distribution. Okay. And so I really appreciate what you said about, it's not really important that they be graded harshly. And in fact, I think there's quite a bit of evidence that that is counterproductive to student learning in many ways. So in addition to having a complete rubric, I also talk to my students about how to do constructive feedback. And the model that I use for that is called the critical response process. And I should have pulled this up earlier. The author, I will dig it up in a moment. But the idea is that this works really well for presentations as well, when you're asking students to comment on each other's work verbally also. There's a point where the author presents their work, and then they can ask the audience, what did you think about this part? What do you think about that part? So they are looking for specific feedback, and that triggers the rest of the class, to actually give that kind of feedback. So that is a really useful process. The second stage is where the audience poses questions back to the author, which are neutral. And this is a key point. You want to train themselves, they want to train the students and yourself to ask questions that are not loaded. So instead of, why is it so long, right, which has a real negative connotation in it, you ask, tell us about your decision on how long you made it. Okay, more neutral. And then this doesn't trigger the automatic defensive response from the author. So after the neutral questions, let's see, I haven't done this in a while because I'm on sabbatical. After the neutral questions is the permission opinion, where if you couldn't get your point across by asking a neutral question about something, if you really wanted to say, I don't think that's right, you ask the author's permission to give feedback on a point. So you can say, I have an opinion about the length of the piece. Do you want to hear it? And this gives the author the chance to say, no, thanks. I know exactly what you're going to say. I don't need to hear it from you. And so that, again, makes the feedback easier to give and way easier to take. And so this process is kind of diffusing of those defensive processes, and it encourages the students to really give valuable feedback. And isn't that what we really want from peer grading?
Yeah, thanks, Jean. That's great. And it does point out that peer grading in the context of a bi-directional and possibly physical class versus peer grading online with less kind of back and forth have different aspects to them.
Although I've done this live, the students are in breakout rooms and they go through this process. Each student gives a presentation and they go through this process for each student. So I found that works online as well in the context of a discussion group. And then when they go to actually do the reading, they know how to give feedback instead of, just filling out numbers on a rubric. They give valuable feedback using this framework written.
I think one of the things your comments point out to me is that the better job that we do in creating community among this online group of students, the more likely we are to do that. And I suspect we have I'm looking at myself here and Allison as a partner, we probably have a lot of room to grow there. These are very diverse. I mean, one of the amazing things to me about these courses is if you look at the roster of students and just go by the names, or if you look at the actual demographic information we have, it's very diverse, diverse across all 6 continents, and we see a fair bit of that, far more diverse than, say, our graduate courses in computer science, which are basically have 2 countries represented, the United States and India, not in that order. And so you do have all the issues and opportunities that brings as well. So, yeah, I don't know who's calling on people, but Krista, you look like you're next.
Thanks, Bobby, for can everybody hear me okay? Thanks for hosting this and sharing your best practices, because I'm just sort of jumping into this this month as working on my Coursera course, which peer grading will be a significant portion of the grading. And it's so important. I feel like it's such an important part of the course. I'm just looking for these best practices, and I'm thinking about doing in the first month, like the first week, putting together a quiz, like doing an example. Here's an example of a peer assignment, and then I will be a student and write something, and then say, what type of feedback would you give this student, A, B, C, or D? And then there's really only one right answer. So it's something that's appropriate to the range. And then it's an appropriate sort of qualitative feedback to maybe show them what the expectations are for peer grading. I'll let you know how that goes. But then I was also wanting everyone's opinion on, since it is so important, has anyone thought of doing like one time a semester, one time in the class, doing a one of your reviews of other students will be graded for a grade? So grading their peer review, and is that too punitive? I just want everyone's thoughts on that, because I thought of that as well. I don't know.
I'll just make the comment that in computer science, this would become somewhat recursive. That is, if the students are all giving each other A's on their assignments, then they will also give each other A's on how well they graded. So the letters alone might not give them that much. Again, it might get back. It's kind of a Gene's point, if you could actually get the comments to be substantive.
I've done.
That's something that I do actually, is I have my TAs scan the critiques, and if they're not substantive, then I have them give the students a nudge so the students get credit in that way for being substantive. But they're not graded. There's no rubric for the rubric, that sort of thing.
I've done peer grading in 2 MOOCs. My first comics MOOC, and then the effective communication MOOC that I guess, Allison, you're going to be working on. And in both cases, Christy, I did the quizzing like you said, and I gave them a video as to how I would grade this. You know, I had a mock paper or a mock presentation, and then quiz them on their grading of it. And in the comics MOOC, I had a lot of students in that in one fell swoop, and I went back and graded 200 of the papers myself later after the MOOC, and I found that generally they were within 7 points of my grading. So I figured that wasn't the worst. It wasn't the best, but it wasn't the worst. And since that was just a one-shot MOOC, once I did it, I didn't do it again. I felt like I could have tightened that up a little bit. So my sense was not this recursive grading, but it was quizzing them on how to grade the rubric so that they had reinforcement. And I was excited about it. Diane, I didn't mean to barge in there. Go ahead.
Oh, no problem at all. I think every class I've done for the last 20 years or so has been peer graded in large part. So, and definitely there have been some radical failures along the way. I think for grading at scale, it's become particularly important. Bobby mentioned a class, the Meaning of IT class that I taught for Atlas and Global Engineering, which had a lot of people in it. And I had TAs And there was a sort of iterative process of educating those TAs. So for example, there were 3 essay tests in the course, and we met each time they had to grade a test. And the first time they got a lot more attention from me. We developed a rubric together, and then they graded, and then I looked at everything and gave them feedback on their grading. And then the second and third times they did it themselves, and then I checked, and they had a sense of scale and what their peers were going to do. That is, one way to work with the TAs, but I also have students grading each other on lots and lots of low stakes assignments. For example, blog posts answering a question where every student in the class has to. You do this a lot, like, once a week, so that it's not as high stakes, and therefore people tend to be more honest. And I produced a rubric that was absolutely simple, and basically their peers would give them a check plus, a check, or a minus. That was it. Minus, you didn't do it. Check, wow, it's okay, but not great. And and check plus, hey, I really thought about it. You made me think about this project. And just that guideline, you don't need to provide too much of a heads up display for students, but any heads up display makes a huge difference in terms of them being able to reorient themselves to what their peers are expecting. The last thing I'll say is I do also a lot of remote classroom assessment techniques. So the assignment you probably all heard of, where at the end of class you have students take out a piece of paper and write down the one most important thing they heard, or the one cloudiest idea that they're the least sure about, or you ask them to define in their own words something that you think is particularly important. I have my TAs grade those, and we do those at least once a week. So I push those out to students on their phones with a Google form. And often they're filling them out, hopefully not in front of cars. They're filling them out as they go to their next classroom or at the beginning of the next class, which means they've walked out the door. They're still thinking about the topic. I've given general guidelines to my TAs, and they just look at all of them. And once again, it's a check plus, a check, or a minus.
Excellent.
Diane, there's one thing that your comments and some others have made me wonder about, and that's the course length. And I'm just going to kind of frame this and see if anybody has wisdom on this. As you all know, these Coursera courses are the equivalent of 1 credit courses. So 5-week courses if they were residential, basically. And in many cases, people will take the equivalent of a 1 semester course here and make it into a sequence of 3 Coursera courses. And in fact, I may be doing that over the next year for a full ethics and computing course. And so in a 5-week course, you don't have that much opportunity to build the culture as you're talking about, because often if we think of that in a semester course, that might be about the point where you're starting to have that culture built. What I don't know is if you have a sequence where, of course, the students aren't required to take all 3, but if they're taking it for a degree, many of them will go all the way through, whether you have that same opportunity that you have in a 1 semester course, that by the second and third of that 3-course Coursera sequence, you can also build a culture among the students. And I don't know if any of you have experience with that.
If you have the same TAs, you can, because I guess we should.
But I meant more, we don't have TAs here. This is for Coursera.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So I would say that there actually are 2 completely different models. One is you're training students to do the work. Yeah. For example, having them rotate as moderators who do the grading, which would be one model. So everybody who was in the first course of 3 then becomes a moderator each week for the second course of 3. And then the people who are in that course being moderated are then moderators for the third course of 3. So the possibility of staggering participation is one way. I've tried this with units in courses as opposed to a full semester.
Stephanie, did you want to, you put an interesting thing in the link there. Did you want to talk about it for a second?
Oh, I think there was some talk about things like the 1-minute paper and those activities. They've been called different things, but have been called classroom assessment techniques. They've been called student engagement techniques. This was just a little article I wrote. I work for the Center for Teaching and Learning. I just wanted to drop that in there. A lot of good resources, and I always recommend those. But I did have a couple comments about peer feedback. I don't know that I would call it peer grading, because there's a lot of research on peer assessment. It's mostly in European journals. It hasn't made its way as strongly into American journals yet, but European and Australian journals. So one of the things that seems to be pretty clear is that peer feedback can be done well for formative activities. So if students are not receiving the final grade from their peers, which they find tremendously unfair, they feel like the final grade should come from the professor. And so I think ways that I've used peer grading, I've done a lot of stuff with rubrics. For instance, I've got another article I'm going to drop in the chat about that with a dorky video. I'll drop that in a minute. Helping or having students, teaching them how to use the rubrics, working through the rubrics with them so they really understand what's expected, and then using those rubrics to do a peer kind of assessment for formative feedback. Students can then use that kind of feedback to revise an assignment or on another assignment where they're using the same kinds of skills. I think that can be really good, but I think we should be very careful about using peer grading for a summative grade.
Excellent.
In
Interesting.
the context of a Coursera course, your options are more or less limited to doing that, or doing everything on a exam where, you know, are right and wrong answers type of exam. So so we have to live within that world.
So I think the larger issue hovering here, there are two, I think. One is about forming community in an online large-scale course, and how possible that is. How possible is it in a smaller asynchronous course where you're not meeting like this in a distance format? So one is about community. And then the other big abstract thing I've been wrestling with ever since I started teaching a MOOC and reflecting, what is the work of grading really? And what is the work of learning and improving over time? Thoughts on this? Either one, community or the work? I mean, what Allison and Bobby reflected on was like, well, they're all giving each other A's, but they're also improving. So what's the value of the A and what's the necessity of the grade? What do people think about that? Laisha.
So I've not taught a MOOC, so I'm talking about much more typical classes that we see at CU. And I, this semester in particular, had to experiment with what I thought was going to be peer grading, or peer grading that would supplement, say, TA grading or my grading to make it more expeditious on some of the smaller, more frequent kinds of tasks. And in the end, I ended up not executing it in a grade sort of mode for various reasons. One of the reasons was that this was a new class and a new class to me, and the projects were pretty substantial and aggressive, and I didn't quite know what an A was going to be.
Right.
Like even I wasn't sure what a sophomore level could produce for the kinds of research I was having them do. So how could I then instruct anybody on what grading would be? So that made me a little nervous. The other thing that made me nervous was folks are dealing sometimes with interview data and some private data, and I just didn't want to expose that to other students and have to deal with anonymizing when the students themselves were just struggling with what it meant to do analysis. So I put that to the side, and I decided to this goes to your question, William, eventually. Sorry, I'm getting there now. So I decided to have them, I guess what I did was, it was actually after the analysis was done, so I wasn't worried about sensitive data, but I had them review each other's work. And what was really important to me for them was on a really challenging project, there were 5 out of 40 that were exceptional, just exceptional. And I asked them then so I curated the set that I wanted them to learn from. And that was some A's and some high B's, as it turns out. They didn't know the grades. I just said, these are great examples for various reasons. They, had different kinds of field sites, and they did some great work. And so I curated the set that I wanted them to see. And then I asked them to do, it's not even peer reviewing, it's almost self-review through peer comparison, but meant to be totally constructive. So I asked them to say, oh, now that you've done a data journey, and you see how this person did a data journey, or this project did a data journey, how would you compare, what did you learn from this? How might you have thought about your project a little bit? Or what did you learn about the domain that they were studying? Or what techniques did you learn from their style of interviewing that you could integrate on the next project? So my interest was really getting them leveled up, so they could then take it to the next project where their grade really counted for more. And so then they had a real understanding of what an A really looked like and what a B really looked like, because I could write comments till the cows came home and they just needed to see it. So, I mean, I think in a way that, this was obviously at such a small scale, William, but to me, it answers your question, because that's ultimately what I wanted them to know. The trick of this was I tried to do this through Canvas, and I ended up having to involve OIT because I was, they have as many of you know, a peer review mechanism on Canvas. And we were you'd think that it turns out it's actually over featured, that it really does go to grading, when I was actually just trying to use this wonderful feature that would deliver the assignments to each other so they could see it, and I wouldn't have to have a separate place where I was keeping them all and all that. Anyway, it was actually, we spent a couple hours on that, and we realized that the way the feature was working was going to favor grading than anything else, which was basically, I thought of it as a virtual poster session with self-reflection that they had to turn in. And so it's a missing feature on Canvas. And then the Canvas name is a little bit of a misnomer of what it's trying to do. Just that goes down the path a little maybe too far, but just to say that I had to kind of improvise outside of Canvas, even though there is a Canvas feature where you think you could actually do what I just said. So,
Laisha, I'm going to just comment that one interesting thing that I know I hadn't thought of that comes out of your experience is that on Coursera, we could provide students with a kind of set of 3 examples that are good, better, best. Now we wouldn't be able, I don't think we could actually use actual student work. We'd probably have to totally manufacture them. But Allison, I don't know what you think. Would that be something you think that might be useful?
Yeah, I think that really could be useful, and especially like I feel like maybe one of the challenges is like teaching students how to grade and also teaching them like the content to look for, because I've noticed some students will go to do a peer grade who maybe didn't understand the material in the first place, and then it's like very hard to expect them to give a fair grade. So yeah, I think a sort of training material where it was very explicit about like what exact things are you looking for in the answer could be really helpful.
What I love about Laisha, what you said, was that really I posed 2 questions, right? One about community and one about grading. And you put them together, right? That ultimately the community needs to digest what the expectations and what the possibilities and what the models are, right? So that this kind of, I'm thinking about this binary now, and I'm wondering if grades don't spike community, if grades aren't a way of dividing community and saying ultimately the master stands over the community, and the kind of thing that you were just discussing isn't a way of saying, let's let the community sort this out. It's you're still there, obviously, right? I mean, you set it all in play and you adjudicated it, but it seems to me that it's a lot more democratic.
Yeah, I wouldn't know how to do it without, so we ended up my TA and I did a pretty serious grading session to get to that point, just to say we didn't save ourselves any grading time at all. What we were hoping to do, what I was hoping to do, was to put, well, the point of the whole course, of course, is to get them in a better state so they knew what the expectations were for the next project, right? So one was kind of this initial get your feet wet project, but it was still pretty challenging for them. And it got them ready for the next one. So in the next one still didn't change how much we had to grade, but the performance by students was overall better, and they had a much clearer understanding without it feeling competitive, because I made sure the students had to know that the 10 I selected were really good examples, but I also made sure I said, hey, I don't want to overwhelm you with examples. Some of you know that you've got good scores, or you were within, a few points of getting an A, and now you know what you might need to work on, but these really just help you understand. And so I hoped that helped reduce that feeling of competition, while also incentivizing, people to do better for themselves by seeing how how others are performing. So anyway, that's all I'll say.
William, we should let Ken in before we run out of time.
Mr. Anderson.
Yes, hi everyone. Thanks for the great discussion. I just wanted to add that the use of peer-based grading that I had in my software engineering course involved the students creating kind of their own little Wikipedia about software engineering. And I had done this in previous courses which didn't have a peer element to it. And I found myself spending my whole time educating people about what plagiarism was and how to properly cite things. And I decided, well, that's a drag. I don't want to keep doing that every time a student writes their first article for this wiki. And so I set up the class the last time I taught it, and it went really well, to have a peer-based review process of the articles that were being generated. And I then kicked it off by creating the first article. And when I did that, I opened up one window, which is where my article was going to be drafted. Then I went to another window and searched on Wikipedia for white box software testing. Then I copied the entire contents of that article in Wikipedia, went over to the other window, pasted it, did submit, and said, okay, I'm done. And see, so it's not gonna take you very long to do this. And then of course the students to kick in and say, you can't do that. You can't just copy that. You can't just point, take that from Wikipedia and then not point to it. And I'm all, you're right. So let's figure out how we would actually have wanted to see someone do that. And so we could say, well, there's this intro that they have of white box testing is very interesting. So maybe I'll take a little excerpt from it. So I deleted everything except for the first little bit, showed them how to cite, quote it, cite it, and then I added some text above and below. And I said, now I've got a start to the article, and this is what I want to see you do, which is, software engineering is a young field, but there's a bajillion things we could talk about. And every day there's a bajillion things added. So there's no way I'm going to cover everything for you. And so the students essentially then undergo over the course of, I think it was 10 or 11 weeks in the semester, generating one article a week on some software engineering topic. And then the review process came in which 3 students had to review the article by a certain date and annotate it with comments. And then I came in ostensibly as the person on Sunday to do grading. And by the time I got there, all the articles were ready to go. All plagiarism issues had been resolved. All annotations have been, proper citations have been put into place. And there had been suggestions at the bottom from the students that had already been responded to by the author. So the actual quality of the article had increased. The topics it covered or the issues it covered had all been updated by the time I actually got there. And so it was a wonderful experience. It worked with, it was at the graduate student level, but worked really well. And if you'll bear with me, I'll just share my screen and show you the finished product. So this was all on GitHub, and every repository that you create on GitHub has this feature here called Wiki. And if you click on the Wiki, we used it as our Foundation of Software Engineering Wikipedia. And throughout the semester, this table of contents page is actually a mess. But over the weeks, the students start to self-organize, and you get themes, so things about programming languages, web development, database systems, organizational, software development, etc. Just what I surprised myself just a few minutes ago was reminding myself how many articles we actually generated, because I've been scrolling now for quite some time. And I just picked one here real quick. Here's one called something about a programming language called Rust. And they did include a screenshot, but they said it was from Stack Overflow, so they were citing it. Got a figure 1 reference here. And then towards the bottom here at the bottom is where 3 students came in and added their comments. And these comments here describe issues or say, I wish you had done something like this, which often was not an issue of the article because the person took that comment and updated the article before I got to see it. So anyway, it was a great experience. And it was one of those situations where my goal was engagement and covering the topic space as opposed to grading. And in that case, in that sense, it delivered in spades. So it was a really positive experience.
Excellent. So I want to give Bobby the last word, but I want to say 3 things. One thing is there's a lot of activity in the chat. There's some really interesting comments about the Coursera format. Laisha's got a good comment about a web program she uses. But my second thing is that the thing that's always so exciting to me about either Coursera or online teaching is that, and we're all hitting it, is that it makes one think about what one's been doing for 20 years, right? You've been teaching all this time and stamping grades on papers, but changing the modality a little bit starts asking questions about community, about the purpose of grading, about whether students can kind of self-govern in the way that Ken opened us up. So I just find this discussion really at the core of what online work is, and then how that reframes teaching in general. So thank you for all that. Thank you to Bobby. I want to look ahead. On April 27th, we have Charlie Nuttleman, who actually has done the most successful popular MOOC that CU Boulder has put out. So I'm going to show up because I want to know what his sauce is. What does he smear on his MOOC that gets people coming like bees to pollen? So to hear the special sauce, April 27th. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Bobby. Thank you, Bobby. Close us out with your general reflections here.
Oh, I'm actually going to do something much simpler than that. Thank you all. I mean, as I said from the start, this was to learn, and I certainly found this great. I think we have a ways to go. A lot of what we reflected on is classroom teaching practices, because we don't have that much experience with Coursera. So my thoughts are that I know I learned a lot, and that we still need more experience that way. But the only thing I want to close out on is I picked this background on purpose. So does anybody know what it is? Diane, you're smiling. You know what it is? Oh. It's up at the Parthenon, but it's a secondary. I actually forgot to look. There's a name to this temple, which is right off, and it's in that exact same area up at the Parthenon. I just figured if we're talking about ethics, we should have ancient Greece in there somewhere, but that's what it is.
All right. Thank you all for coming. I wish you a great end of the semester, and thank you, Bobby. It was great to hear from everyone. Thank you all. Onwards.